At first glance, evolutionary theory seems incompatible with pro-social behavior. Why would someone expend energy or place their own life in jeopardy to help someone else when the idea of survival of the fittest seems inherently competitive rather than pro-social? However, if we recognize that survival of the fittest is not necessarily survival of the individual, but instead survival of one's genetic material, then we see the potential advantage of pro-social behavior. If your relatives or kin share some of your genes, then pro-social behavior that helps your kin survive and reproduce also helps to pass on a portion of your genes to the next generation. And so the theory is that pro-social behavior should favor close genetic relatives, particularly when we're talking about life-saving help. So the hypothetical scenario would be that there's a fire and you can only save one person, your sibling or your friend. Now, of course, there will be exceptions to the rule. It's individuals who may select their friend if they're really close to that friend, or maybe they hate their sibling. But the research suggests that on average, people report that they would pick their family member. Evolutionary theory is also invoked to explain the in-group bias in pro-social behavior. Research suggests that people are more likely to help an in-group as opposed to an out-group member. And so our in-group is the group that we belong to, that we identify with. The out-group is the group that is not inclusive of us, right? Is the other group that we are not a part of. The evolutionary theory is that in-group members are more similar and more likely to share our genes than out-group members. Even if this genetic overlap between our genes and another in-group member is minimal, it's still greater than it would be the overlap between our genes and an out-group member. Also, we may expect greater reciprocity from in-group members. This is the idea that an in-group member is more likely to return the favor and help us at a later date. So we'll look at the research that supports this in-group bias in helping, or kind of this greater likelihood to help someone who is similar to the self compared to a dissimilar other. In a classic study by Enzwiller and colleagues, they found that students were more likely to help someone who was similar versus dissimilar to them. And so they had research Confederates dress up as either a hippie or they dressed more straight-laced. So keep in mind that this was the late 60s, early 70s. This was published in 1971. And so this would have made sense given the time period. So we have our research Confederates who are working with the researchers operating based on the script, who are dressed as either a hippie or dressed straight-laced, and they would go around campus and approach students out on the sidewalk and ask them for a dime to make a phone call. Right? So this is back when we have pay phones instead of cell phones. And so they would ask for a favor, right? I am in need of help. I need a dime to make a phone call. The question is, will this person that's approached, will the student who's approached by our Confederate agree and help and give this person a dime? And the students that they would approach would be either dressed like a hippie, or they would be dressed more kind of straight-laced. And so we could make a number of different predictions. Or we could make predictions based on the nature of the student who's approached. We could say maybe that hippies are more helpful. So regardless of what our Confederate is dressed as, if they approach a hippie who's a student, right, that student would be more likely to lend a dime. Right? We could say maybe, the whole free love type of mentality is increasing helping behavior. Or we might say maybe the straight-laced students would be more helpful. We could make the argument that maybe those who are dressed more straight-laced are maybe more conscientious. And so therefore, maybe they're just more likely to have a dime to lend to our Confederate or to give to our Confederate. And so maybe the straight-laced students would be more helpful. What Enswiller and colleagues found was not that one group of students was more helpful than the other, the hippies were more helpful or straight-laced students were more helpful, but rather that both groups were more helpful towards in-group members. So if our Confederate was dressed as a hippie, he was more likely to receive a dime when he approached other hippies and asked for a dime compared to when he approached straight-laced students. If our Confederate is dressed straight-laced, he's more likely to receive a dime when he approached straight-laced dressed students compared to when he approached hippies. So it wasn't that one group was more helpful than the other, but that both groups were more helpful to in-group members. And research has backed this up. That we can look to cultural differences, and there are differences in cultural values that can promote pro-social behavior, but still this pattern persists in that across cultures, people are more likely to help someone that they define as a member of their in-group compared to those that they perceive as an out-group.